Hello, everybody. Welcome to our final lesson on the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 50. This will be a fairly short one compared to some of the other chapters we've done. With this lesson, I have fulfilled my promise to cover the last half of the book of Genesis that we started the first half in live Wednesday night classes. And then when Brother Mark took over as the new preacher, I promised that I'd go ahead and finish the book of Genesis, and I am doing so with this lesson. Haven't totally decided what to do after that. Part of me is thinking about going back to the first 25 chapters of Genesis that we'd covered in live classes, and maybe write up some PowerPoint notes and do some audio for that, just so that I could have the whole book of Genesis posted up online for any future reference. So that might be a possibility. Another possibility would be to just go right on into the book of Exodus and cover the continued story of the Israelites from there. Haven't made up my mind which one I want to do first. I'll probably at some point do one or the other of those, but after finishing this lesson, I am going to need to take a break for a little while because I do have some other obligations, including some promises I made to people to help them out between now and April 15th. So that may have to come first after finishing this. So let's get on into Genesis chapter 50. So as the chapter begins, Jacob has just died at the end of chapter 49. He was 147 years old. He'd been 130 years old when he moved to Egypt, when he and his family moved to Egypt, and he lived 17 years in Egypt up to the point of his death. He had made Joseph promise that he would not be buried in Egypt, but that his body would be taken home, so he could be buried in the cave of Machpelah, along with his his first wife Leah, and also with his parents Isaac and Rebekah, and his grandparents Abraham and Sarah. He obviously put great store by that, and that's certainly understandable. So as the chapter begins, we're going to proceed with the funeral preparations, which are impressive for the Egyptians. Let's go on to the text. So Genesis 50, starting at verse 1. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel, Jacob. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. And I would assume, as the Egyptians were mourning him for 70 days, I would assume that his family was similarly inclined to do so. Verse 4, and when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, if now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore let me please go up and bury my father, then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, go up and bury your father as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of the household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds, were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians." Therefore, the place was called Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them, for his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. So this is indeed a most impressive funeral service. 40 days to mummify his body and pack it, wrap his body in the mummy fashion, and wrap it in an elaborate coffin. Again, 40 days of processing, but the Egyptians had it down because, as you may know if you've been to some of the museums. I know a number of years back, Laura and I went to the museum in Chicago, and there were several mummies there. Again, these mummies, some of them were buried thousands and thousands of years ago, and they're amazingly well preserved, provided that they weren't disturbed, or in the latter cases, they were put in a place where the air sealed out, and the mummies are protected behind sealed and elaborate display cases. So it would have been an impressive activity. Again, 40 days to mummify him, 70 days in the whole process of preparing his body and mourning his loss. Very elaborate. We obviously don't do anything that elaborate today in the U.S. And then the funeral procession itself would have been worthy of a pharaoh. There's horsemen, chariots, elders from Egypt, and then of course the sons of Jacob themselves, with Joseph probably in the lead. The children, the rest of the family remain behind in Egypt. They travel northward to the land of Canaan. When they get to the place that they would call Abel Mizraim, it's apparent that most of the historians, the Bible scholars, think it was just over the Jordan River, crossing into the land of Canaan. And there they further mourned for 7 days there, so much so that the Canaanites saw all these Egyptians mourning and thought this must have been a truly impressive person who they were memorializing in this funeral service. And then, if I understand it correctly from the text, the sons themselves, the 12 sons of Jacob themselves, took his mummified body to the cave of Machpelah and uh, physically entombed him there. Um, the cave of Machpelah again is just on the outskirts today of the city of Hebron. In fact, Hebron has grown up around it, but it is in a closed off area, and it is a shrine because again Abraham is buried there, so even the Muslims consider it a holy shrine, and it's certainly something that Jews and Christians would memorialize as well. And so the funeral is completed, and then they all turn back toward Egypt. So they have returned to Egypt, and now comes an issue. Joseph's brothers realize, okay, Joseph wouldn't do anything while dad was alive, but dad is dead and buried. Now what's going to happen? And so the brothers are once again fearing for their lives. So let's get to verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Um, his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." This must have been agonizing to Joseph to realize that even now his brothers are still afraid for their lives, so much so that they made up a story that Jacob had said, "Forgive your brothers and don't take any vengeance against them." Um, and verse 19, but Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And so Joseph will continue to care for his extended family, his brothers and their wives and children and grandchildren, all who have settled now in Goshen in the Nile Delta of Egypt. And Joseph will continue to take the responsibility for seeing to their needs for the remainder of his life. And so Joseph, as we'll see here, will reach the ripe old age of 110, which for any Egyptian must have been a long life indeed. But for somebody from the Hebrew stock, where his father lived to 147 and his grandfather lived to 180 and his great grandfather lived to 175, 110 is not that long by comparison. Obviously, Joseph, if you remember, Joseph had been 30 years old when Pharaoh had appointed him to be the number two guy in Egypt. And so he's going to die at 110. So Joseph has ruled in Egypt as Pharaoh's number two, and effectively the ruler of all details in Egypt for 80 years, and the responsibilities and the pressure of that rule must have physically weighed on him, and thus he does not see the lifespan that his even his father, and nor his earlier ancestors had reached. So let's again for the text here. Verse 22. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So Joseph gets he gets a promise from his brothers. Obviously, some of his brothers are surviving him, which is kind of ironic, but such is the case. He gets a promise from them that he would not be buried in Egypt, but that his coffin would be taken back to Canaan for burial. Um, and Joseph, having again been the number two ruler of Egypt, he probably goes through the same elaborate funeral process as his father had done um, sometime earlier. Um, Joseph is probably mummified again in the Egyptian tradition. Has a similar service to what his father is, except that uh, there is no actual burial of the coffin. We will learn later from the biblical text, particularly when we get to the book of Joshua, that, well, even in the book of Exodus, when the children of Israel leave, we know that the his descendants from the tribe of Ephraim took responsibility for Joseph's coffin, and they saw to carrying Joseph's coffin with them on their journeys and during the years in the wilderness, and then at the very end of the book of Joshua, it refers to Joseph being buried in the field that his father Jacob had originally purchased from the family of Shechem back in Genesis chapter 33. And so Joseph was buried there. He was not buried in the cave of Machpelah, but he was buried in the land of Canaan as he had insisted on a promise to do so. And so it is. And so that wraps up the story of Joseph and concludes the book of Genesis. Now, of course, the story doesn't end here. Moses is writing all of the all but perhaps just a few late insertions to these first five books of the Old Testament, and Moses will, of course, continue the story right on into the book of Exodus, which will be much of which is autobiographical because Moses will start to write about his own life, his own birth, and how he was found, how his the warning that they were trying to control the population of the Hebrews by killing off the baby boys, and his mother put him in a sealed basket uh, and let him float in the Nile River, and the daughter of Pharaoh finds him, and Moses is raised um, in the Egyptian tradition, although for a nurse, he's allowed to, um, again, through the providence of God, he's cared for by his own mother as his nurse. Um, and Moses, um, again, is raised as Egyptian royalty, but when he sees an Egyptian mistreating uh, other Hebrews, and he intervenes and kills the Egyptian, and then of course he has to flee Egypt, and then that leads to the story of how Moses spends 40 years in the Sinai region as a sheep herder, and then he marries and begins and starts a family. And then God appears to him in the burning bush, and God instructs Moses that he will be the one who will go back to Pharaoh and command Pharaoh to let my people go. Um, and of course, Pharaoh will renege on that. God will send 10 plagues to against Egypt. Some of the plagues will affect even the Hebrews, but the latter plagues affect only the Egyptians. And then, of course, the last plague is the death of the firstborn. Um, and the Hebrews avoided that by uh, spreading the blood on their doorposts. But the Egyptians lose their firstborn in each of their households. And after that, Pharaoh, again, a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, would enslave the Israelites, the pharaohs of the future. Um, Pharaoh uh, at first allowed the Israelites to leave, and then he reneges on that promise and sends the army after them to bring them back, and all that accomplishes is getting the army drowned. You know the story of the crossing of the Red Sea and how the Israelites were able to cross on dry land between the waters, but then the waters collapsed upon the Egyptians when they pursued after them. And again, the children of Israel will, by Exodus chapter 20, will end up at Mount Sinai, where God will give them the Ten Commandments and then give the law to Moses. But as we'll see, the children of Israel, the ones who had been born and had been raised in Egypt, are self centered, are not true believers. They'll turn back to idolatry when Moses isn't there to guide them, and and then even by the time they get to the land of Canaan, they panic and seeing the powerful, how powerful the Canaanites were, and seeing giants in the land, and so God will have enough and will basically uh, make the Israelites wander for 40 years until that full generation of Israelites who had been born and raised in Egypt, until that whole generation dies out. And the next generation comes up who had been born and raised on during the wilderness years and were hardened by circumstances and ready to go in and conquer the land of Canaan. And then they would reach the promised land. And then, of course, all of this is recorded. Moses has the first half of Exodus is the everything the plagues, and Moses, the plagues, and their journeys across the Red Sea and down to Sinai. And then the second half of Exodus is God giving Moses the law at Sinai and the book of Leviticus, and then his further details of the law. And then in Numbers, the people are counted. And then God, again, after they've spent 2 years at Sinai, they resume their journey. But again, the Israelites are unfaithful, and God determines he's got to kill off that that generation first before the next generation will have the willingness to conquer the land. And that's again the book of Numbers, and then the book of Deuteronomy restates a number of these factors that had happened and restates God's law. And then, of course, the book of Joshua is them conquering the land. And so that wraps up Genesis chapter 50 and my study of the book of Genesis. Hope you've enjoyed it. And so take care and God bless.